Don't get hacked. Today, we're talking about data privacy and cybersecurity issues in video games like Fortnite and Grand Theft Auto. Join us. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lawyers with Game. I'm Darius Gambino, and I'm an attorney with Saul Ewing in Philadelphia. Over my 20-year career, I've advised clients on issues related to patents, trademarks, and copyrights. I'm also a lifelong gamer, currently playing on the PlayStation 5, and you can find me on the PlayStation Network as EaglesFan71. With me today are my colleagues from our cybersecurity and privacy practice, the two co-chairs of the practice, Sandy Bilus and Evan Foster. Sandy, Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Darius. Glad to be here.
Happy to have you guys on. How does it feel to be officially Lawyers with Game?
It feels great. I'm also a lifelong gamer. And I'll tell you that my children and I are looking ahead to the release of Baldur's Gate 3. I don't know if that's on your radar, but we're going to be getting that very soon.
Oh, absolutely. I've been hearing about it quite a bit, that it's about as close as you can get to a tabletop Dungeons and Dragons experience. And it sounds like it's going to be great. I don't know that I can get into another game of that depth, but
it's hundreds and hundreds of hours of playtime, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into your guys' background and your practice. Starting with you, Evan, just like to hear about, some of the issues that you deal with in cybersecurity and privacy on a daily basis.
Sure, thanks. So I too am a lifelong gamer and lifelong IT guy. So actually, prior to going to law school, I had my own IT consulting business for many years. So I usually spend a lot of time fixing gaming rigs and building gaming rigs, and recently helped my son go through that exercise, as well as doing some keyboard modding. So I'm big into the scene. In terms of what we're seeing today, so both Sandy and I and our group continue to handle a lot of ransomware attacks, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth. But we spend a lot of time doing incident response for cybersecurity incidents. We also handle a lot of business email compromise. Essentially what happens when an organization's email account or email system gets hacked and is used to send some kind of malicious emails or phishing emails. And then we also are still handling a fair amount of good old-fashioned hacking, right? So some nefarious person compromising a system some way, getting inside and doing all kinds of bad stuff.
And Sandy, how about you? What are some of the issues that you're facing right now?
As the co-chair with Evan, I'm seeing a lot of the same things he is with my clients, but I also help many clients deal with compliance with privacy laws, many of which have cybersecurity components to them. So I help them scope out whether those laws apply to their companies, what they require the company to do when it comes to the collection and use of information that is about people. And then I also help companies defend lawsuits over either cybersecurity attacks or privacy law breaches, things like that.
For the uninitiated who are watching the show, I wanted to give a little bit of background on cyber attacks. You mentioned ransomware, Evan. Can you guys just give a little bit of an outline of like what each of these different attacks look like and what their intended purpose is?
So ransomware, for those who are not familiar, is essentially a piece of code that is dropped onto somebody's system, and usually it can come in a couple different flavors. Originally, ransomware just got onto your system and locked or encrypted your files such that you were no longer able to access them. Then you would get an email from the attacker demanding a payment, a ransom, usually in Bitcoin, in order to get a key to unlock the encrypted files. The ransomware gangs have evolved So now, instead of just simply locking your system, most ransomware these days also exfiltrates files out of your system. Um, so it's kind of like a double attack. Not only are your files encrypted, but the threat actor also makes a demand that says that they're going to release your information unless you pay the ransom. So it's designed basically to create a sort of double extortion threat.
And Sandy, you mentioned phishing as well. You want to talk about that a little bit, about the ways that's used to kind of extort a company's emails and then use them with third parties that may or may not realize that the company is not behind the email.
Phishing is another way that the bad guys, the threat actors, can get access to systems when they shouldn't have that access. So, for instance, they may send an email containing a link to a site that pretends to be another website and asks the person who clicks on the link to enter in their login information for the site. And then the site captures that login information, including a password. And now all of a sudden the bad guys have that information and they can log into the system pretending to be a legitimate user. And, many attacks these days are by exploiting technological or technical flaws in software and hardware. But more and more we're seeing attacks that are exploiting human flaws in the system. So our own employees, they're the people who are being targeted with whether it's phishing emails or social engineering attacks, which I know Evan and I are planning to talk about a little later in the podcast. But also, they basically go after people because they're the weak link in the chain. And it's relatively easy to fix a technical problem. It's harder to fix a human problem when they fall for tricks. And so that's what we're seeing more and more of.
And you've got all different types of people of different ages and different experience levels with technology inside of an organization. Some younger people might be more savvy to those things where some older people might not. So you've got different levels of threat to protect against, I'm sure.
You'd be surprised. Even some of the younger people who should be savvy are not. So
right.
Really, there are dangers all around.
Right. Well, let's take this into the realm of video games. One of the biggest hacks that I noticed in the last couple of years was for a huge game franchise, Grand Theft Auto, from Rockstar Games. They are currently working on Grand Theft Auto 6 right now. It's highly anticipated. And last September, a hacker named, I think his name is Teapot Tube Hacker or something like that, got access to Rockstar's files and information for the game in development and released, I think, something over like 50 or 60 videos and files. So let's talk about that. How does something like that happen, or how did that particular instance happen? And, what can game companies do to stop that from happening?
Yeah, sure. So Darius, so Sandy mentioned social engineering, and the best information that we know now is that was a social engineering attack on Rockstar. It was alleged to have been perpetrated by a 17-year-old in the United Kingdom who is at least alleged to be part of a criminal syndicate who was also responsible for a couple of other gaming company or attacks on a couple of other gaming companies, including Microsoft and Ubisoft, as well as potentially Uber and Samsung and a host of others. So he has since been arrested, and there's not sort of full details out on the nature of the attack. But from what we know, it was started by him social engineering somebody within Rockstar, and through that was able to gain access to some internal systems and then work his way over to the areas where those videos were kept.
Kind of when you say social engineering, that means like approaching someone on more of like a personal level with like a job interview or something that is outside the context of their company and what they're working on, which would have been the game.
Absolutely. Or it could have been him finding out, using social media or LinkedIn, other places, finding out somebody who was on the development team or worked in support or help desk for Rockstar, and calling him up and purporting to say, "Hey, I'm a dev. I'm trying to work on this. I can't get access to this file. Can you help me?" And of course, we as humans, and particularly folks on the help desk, are trained to be helpful, right? And so, maybe not as skeptical, or maybe shouldn't have, or should have pushed back a little bit more. But in the desire to be helpful and accommodating, may have let their guard down a little bit and allowed or given that person credentials or access that they shouldn't have.
Yeah, and another social, I think it was another social engineering attempt I wanted to ask you about, Sandy, was with the PC game Axi Infinity, which is an NFT based game. It's a P to E, or a play to earn NFT game, where basically you can go on and you collect these pets. It's kind of like a Pokemon thing where you collect pets and they battle each other. And if you win enough battles, you win additional pets, which are NFTs, which then can be sold for real world value. It was a hugely popular game. You had people creating farms in foreign countries to just play the game and earn money. And that game was subject to an attack, where I think it was over 500 million in crypto that was taken from the company, part of the assets of the game. So what do you know about that attack, and some things that they could have done to maybe avoid it?
Yeah, well, that was another social engineering attack. So what happened there was the developer of the game is Sky Mavis. One of their engineers was approached by people claiming to be job recruiters through LinkedIn, and they sent him emails. He got interested in the possible job opportunity that they were talking about. They went through interviews where they interviewed him. And then at the end of the day, they said, "You've got an offer. Here it is." And it was a PDF file that they sent to him. And when he opened the PDF, it was filled with spyware. And that just opening the PDF unloaded the spyware into Sky Mavis's system, according to published reports. And then from there, the threat actors were able to basically take control of Sky Mavis's system and use it to drain their accounts of cryptocurrency.
The thing about that one that I found interesting is we always talk about how blockchain is intended to be distributed, right? So that not like your normal bank account where you can do a direct attack. With a distributed network on a blockchain where you have all these different nodes, it's more difficult to orchestrate an attack like that. But they were still able to do that and to get close to $500 million, right?
Right. Yeah. So you can see, I mean, through some of the attacks that we've been talking about, the dangers here include your systems being locked down through ransomware, personal information being stolen that relate to players or other people, your employees. You could lose your IP, right? The crown jewels of your company, and you might just have money stolen from you. I these attacks can go in a lot of different ways once they're in your system.
Right. And I think the lesson that I took away from that one was, even if you've got, a DeFi or a blockchain financial system, that's no guarantee that you still can't have money stolen.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So the next one I wanted to ask you about is one of probably my favorite games of all time, or the developer of one of my favorite games of all time, The Witcher, which is CD Projekt Red, based in Poland. They were subject to an attack last year. People got access to work in progress for, I think, what amounted to be a 4K upgrade to The Witcher 3. And then the game that they had released in 2021, some updates to that, which is Cyberpunk 2077, which is kind of like a Blade Runner-esque first-person game. So, Evan, I'll ask you about that one. Now we're talking about, a breach, I think for servers in Poland, right? How did that one happen, and who was at the heart of that attack.
That was another example of a ransomware attack. And I think it's helpful for the audience to understand, how these typically work, because they happen in concert with some of the other tactics that we have been talking about. So, for example, a ransomware, may start out with a phishing email that somebody within the organization, within the company, clicks and downloads on the computer. Once that payload has been deposited on one of the company's systems, it may open up or sort of signal to the attackers that there's an opening on the system. Nowadays, it's very often the case that those access points are controlled and actually sold and brokered by one part of a gang, a criminal gang, and then they sell off that access to another, criminal gang, who then actually goes and deploys the ransomware or exfiltrates the information. So you could actually be dealing with, and we've had cases where this has absolutely been the case, where you're actually dealing with multiple threat actors who have compromised your systems. So you have one, the access broker who has gained access to the system, and they may have stolen information, or they may simply, kind of unlocked the door, and then they post on the dark web and say, hey, now we have access to this system, and they identify the target, to the extent that they can, and then they sell off that access to another organization who will then deploy the ransomware and engage in, the ransom or exfiltration of the data. That then gets posted usually on a dark web forum. And so it's known, and these gangs are very good and very sophisticated about identifying who the target is and leveraging information that they capture from the systems in order to up the ransom demand.
So is that what happened in the case of CD Projekt Red? Was it one company found the unlocked door and then sold it to another company?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen anything publicly on exactly how that worked, but at the end of the day, it was they were able to exfiltrate the source code and post source code online, and that's what they were looking to sell.
That's really interesting. Like that, there's just companies that go around and look for unlocked digital doors, right? And then they're not going to get involved in the attack, maybe for because they want to limit their exposure or whatever. But then they're selling that to someone else who's actually making the attack. So
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, well, and you can also imagine if you're Project Red, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, listen, we have stolen your source code, and we want $1 million in Bitcoin." You can imagine that the value of that source code to Project Red, may be considerably more than the $1 million demand that's being asked for. And so oftentimes that's really what you see, that these threat actors, they have done their due diligence before they make their ransom demand. And they calibrate their demand to be at the right level to sort of incentivize getting the ransom paid.
Right. Sandy, I wanted to switch gears and ask you about a situation that occurred with Epic Games. It was an FTC action and a settlement related to breach of privacy, which is something we really haven't talked about. We talked mostly about attacks, but we have things like in Europe, the GDPR, and we hear about privacy regulations all the time. Any company that collects personal information, or PII, personally identifiable information, has to take care with that information, because if it gets out there, then they're subject to their own liability, sometimes through a civil action or through a government agency like the FTC. So can you talk about that a little bit and what happened in that case with Epic Games?
Yeah, sure. And just to take a step back, privacy, just like you said, privacy laws control what companies can do with personal information. So they put obligations on companies when it comes to what sorts of information they can collect about people and then who they can share it with and why, and what they can do with it once they've got it, right? And sometimes they also say you've got to protect that information against unauthorized use or disclosure or theft. So there's a security aspect to these privacy laws as well. And one significant privacy law that's out there is called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is called COPA or COPPA, depending on who you're talking to. And the FTC is the enforcer of COPA, and that's where Epic Games screwed up. So basically, they were collecting information about their gamers, from their gamers, many of whom were under 13 years old. And COPPA says that if you're going to collect personal information online from people who are under 13, you have to have parental consent. And Epic was not apparently doing that in an adequate way. And so they ended up agreeing to pay a $275 million penalty for violating the COPPA rule. Separately, and in a linked action, they also agreed to pay $245 million to the FTC for using what are called dark patterns and dark billing practices to extract more money from gamers. So dark patterns are basically when you use the system or the website that you're using to encourage people to take some steps and to not take others, through using different fonts or colors. Like, for instance, you might put the accept or the I agree button in bright white font with, fireworks exploding all over it, and the I do not agree button as dark, tiny font over in the corner. That's called a dark pattern, and it can be misleading or confusing to consumers. So the FTC didn't like that either, so they hit them with that double penalty.
Yeah, and obviously Epic's biggest game is Fortnite. We all know what a phenomenon that's been over the past 5 or so years. And primarily, the gamers that they were seeing were under the age of 13, or a lot of them were, certainly. Yeah. And we saw a lot of complaints about that game because of that. And I think now, due to this action, they've implemented a new onboarding procedure where if you are under 13, you have to do a check with a parent or guardian before they'll give you an account.
Right. That's exactly right. And COPPA's been around for years now. It's not something that's a new, scary thing on the scene, but there are many new state privacy laws that are coming into effect and being passed just this year. I think 4 more states passed new privacy laws, all of which could apply to gaming companies and tech companies. If they're doing business in the states where these are passed. So, they really should be looking at and scoping out whether those laws apply to them and whether or not they restrict what they can be collecting and doing with personal information.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to end on. I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to talk about, the kind of the future, where you see things going in the next couple of years. What are some proactive steps that companies can be taking right now? Because honestly, we've talked about huge numbers in the millions of dollars. We talked about some really scary threats. So, what are some things, if companies are thinking about this, or maybe they've never done any kind of analysis of their systems to check vulnerabilities or things like that? I'll start with you, Evan. What are some things that you think companies can do to protect themselves?
Sure. Well, from a cybersecurity standpoint, the first thing to do is really to conduct a risk assessment. And that can be done, either internally or with the assistance of a third party. And essentially, that is, sitting down and really conducting an exercise to understand, what are the risks that the organization, company faces, and that could be based on the types of data that you have. It could be, the types of intellectual property that you have. And then from there, the risk assessment helps provide sort of a pathway or a roadmap as to some of the types of things that you might do to mitigate or remediate some of these issues. So one thing that we think, people just can't do enough of is training. So we talked about social engineering, and probably the best mitigation against social engineering is to have good training. Similarly, having a good incident response plan. So if you are hit with a cybersecurity event, having a documented incident response plan that sort of outlines the steps and, who is going to be part of the team that's going to respond to the incident. How are you going to respond? What are the steps you're going to do? That's sort of crucially important. And we've helped a lot of clients, go through incident response plans and then do a subsequent tabletop exercise where, it's great. It's a gaming exercise, right? Where you sort of game out, a simulated cybersecurity event. And then you get all of your stakeholders in a room and figure out, okay, now that we've, suffered this event, how are we going to respond? What are some things we need to think about? So those are things that we suggest to all clients to do to help, kind of assess their overall cybersecurity preparedness.
Yeah, those are some great suggestions. Sandy, some final comments from you?
Yeah, I mean, on the privacy side of things, Darius, I mentioned doing a scoping exercise. And what I mean by that is essentially figuring out which privacy laws apply to your company. And that entails, confirming where you're doing business, how much information you're collecting about people and where those people live. And then once you've determined whether or not a particular privacy law applies to your company, then you go about meeting your obligations that are imposed on you by that law. So it might include making sure that you've got privacy notices that are being displayed to people to show them what you're collecting about them and what you do with that information. It might include making sure you're getting consent, whether from people themselves or from the parents of children, and being able to document and prove that you got that consent, so that if a regulator shows up at your door later and says, show me where you got consent, right? You can say, yes, here it is, right? And then some of the other things you might do is making sure you've got the right contracts in place with your vendors that are helping you to collect and process personal information. A lot of these privacy laws require you to have very specific provisions in those contracts anytime you're going to be sharing personal information with a third party. So those are some of the key things you can do on the privacy compliance side of things.
All great suggestions. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. If you have any questions about any of the legal issues that we discussed, drop them into the comments and we'll try to answer them without providing any actual legal advice. Until next time, I want to thank my colleagues Sandy and Evan for coming on. Thank you, guys. Keep in mind that this series is intended to be a very general discussion of legal issues in the video game industry. It is not intended as actual legal advice. If you need actual legal advice, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to help. And we will see you next time on Lawyers with Game.
Thanks, Darius.
Thanks, Darius.